Hello everyone and welcome to this tutorial on how to create a multi-layered parallax effect using HTML, CSS and JavaScript. So what I have here is a basic project setup, and in there of course we've got our index.html file. In this we link to an empty JavaScript file which is located in our JS folder, as well as to the jQuery CDN, and that's because we're using jQuery as the JavaScript library for this tutorial. We're also linking to a CSS file which holds some basic styles that will save us some time later on in the video. We also have a set of images that we'll use for the illustration, and all of these files can be downloaded from the description below. So let's start by writing our markup, and don't worry about the styles and the logic for now. In the HTML we will start by creating a section, and this section will have a class of header and for now an ID of home. In this we will now create a set of divs, and these will later on represent the layers in our illustration. So we'll start off by saying div, and this div will have a class of layer and a class of layer-bg. BG of course standing for background, because later on in the CSS we want to style each of the layer independently and give them their own image. Later on in the JavaScript we also want to move each layer at its own speed, and if we want to define an HTML element specific value in the HTML that we can later on use in our JavaScript, we can do this by using data attributes. In this case we want to define a data attribute using the name speed, and we can do this by saying data-speed and just applying value to this. So for the background I want that to scroll at the pace of 0.1, and you'll see later on what this value does. Now we will copy this div element, and in my illustration we have the background and then 3 layers on top of that. So I'll create one for layer 1, one for layer 2 and one for layer 3, and in there I will give each of them a different speed. So the layer 1 will have a speed of 0.3, and of course we have to rename the class of this. Then for layer 2 I want a speed of 0.6, and for layer 3, which is the layer that will move at the same speed as the rest of the website, we will give that a speed of 1, so that the transition is really smooth and it's just scrolling at the same speed as the rest of the website. As well as that, the JavaScript code sometimes is laggy on small devices and devices with a slow processor. So what we can do is we will add a div element and just give this a class of mobile header, and on small devices we will display this with a static image instead of this section with the different layers. We will also need a section for the rest of our content, so I'll just create a section and give this a class of content. In there I will now create a div element and give this a class of container, just so we can style the text in it a little bit, and then we'll add some lorem ipsum text, and that will be the HTML for now. So let's now start adding some styling to our website. First we'll start by styling the container class, and this class will just have some margin, and it will have 0 for the y-axis and auto on the x-axis, so that it will center automatically. It will also have a max width of 1000 pixels, and if we go ahead and look at our browser now, you will see that we have some nice margin on the sides and that the content is centered nicely. If we go back into our editor, we can now start by styling the rest of the page. The header section will have a styling of a minimum height, and as the minimum height we're using the height of our illustration, which is 1537 pixels, and we're using minimum height and not just height because maybe you've got some content in your header, and if you've got text, for example, on smaller devices, that will expand on the y-axis, and we don't want the text to overlap into your next section. To give some space for the header to extend, we'll now also give this a height of auto so that it can actually expand, and an overflow hidden attribute in case anything would expand of the background. And we'll also say position relative, and you should know the basic CSS positioning by now. If not, you should maybe go and look it up before you continue with this tutorial, because it's quite essential for how this works. Now we'll start by styling the mobile header, and as I said before, this shouldn't display in every size, just on small sizes, so we'll start off by giving this a property of display none, so it doesn't display anything. Then we'll also give this a minimum height and the height of auto, so that it can expand if we need anything. And then we can already start by giving this background image. The background image will use the URL, and I've got a nice extension in this editor so that it displays me all the directories. So for me, this is in the /assets/images folder, and what I'm looking for is the illustration complete. We'll also do some styling for the background, so we'll say that the position will be at the bottom, and also we want it to be centered on the x-axis. We also want the background that it does not repeat itself in case the image is too large for the screen, but rather we want the background to cover everything and stretch it so that it fits. Now that's it for the mobile header for now. Later on we'll use a media query to apply a display non-property to the header and a display block to the mobile header. Now we will move on by styling the layer, and for now we'll just style the general layer. In this we will say background position, or we can basically just copy this because it's the same styling for the layers, and we don't say this in the individual layer classes. We do this here because that would just save us some code if we do it in the general layer class. We'll also give this a width of 100%, and we'll also give it a minimum height as we did before and the height of auto. We will also say position fixed this time, and as I said before, you should know what that does, and then we'll say the z-index is equal to -1. Now we can go ahead and start by styling the individual layers. First, I'll start by styling the layer -bg, which is the background class, and I'll start by giving this a background image of a URL, and this is all we need to do for this styling, so I'll just quickly grab the image, and as you can see the images are listed here, and it's the layer _bg. We can now copy this 3 more times for the different layers, and I'll just start by saying layer 1, and this will have a class of 2. Layer 2 will have a class of will have an attribute of layer 1, and layer 3 will have the image layer 0. If we go ahead and look at our browser now, we can actually see that we already have the images displaying, but if we scroll down, the text actually scrolls over the image and we don't have the parallax effect happening yet. Before we start writing our JavaScript code, we will now add the media query to actually make our mobile header work. So we can do this by saying add media, and then as a query we want to say max width, and we'll give this a width of 768 pixels. And in this media query we will actually say .header, and this will, if we're below that pixel size, have a display value of none, and the mobile header therefore then has a display value of block. That way this also works on mobile resolutions and on mobile phones. So yeah, let's go ahead and start by writing the logic in our JavaScript file. So the first thing we want to know is when a user actually scrolls over our page, and we can do this by saying $ and then in brackets window.scroll. This is a function, and in there we actually have a closure, so we'll say function, and in here is actually where all the logic's going to happen. First, we want to see how far a user actually scrolled down our page, and we can store this in a variable, and for now I'll just name this scroll top. We can get this value by saying $ and again in brackets window.scroll top. Just like we already named the variable, that's the name of the function we're going to use. Now we could go ahead and log this out if we want to, but I'm not going to. It basically just prints out the number of pixels that we scrolled down from the top. Now what we want to do now is loop over each individual layer, because the speed value is something that's layer specific, so we can't calculate that here. To loop over all the layers we can do $ and then in brackets, and just use a normal CSS selector like saying .layer, and then we can say .each, so we loop over each of the layer classes or every div that has a layer, and in here we also have another closure, and we can say function, and we don't do that, and in here we now can store the layer in a variable, so we can say the layer is equal to this object that we get from the looping, and that just makes it easier for us later on to use the layer object. Now we can actually get the data speed we defined in our index.html. That's basically the code written here. So if we're looping over all the images, and currently we're at layer 1, then we want to get this value for the layer so that we can calculate the speed that it's moving. So we will get this value by first of all saying variable and then data speed, so we want to save it in variable, and then we can do layer, referring to the layer object we just created by setting it equal to this object, and then we can say .data, and this is how we get something from a data object. And as a parameter we now have to pass which data object we actually want to use, and we already named our speed in the HTML, so we can just pass speed as a parameter in here. Now that we got this value, we can actually calculate the offset that the layer should have, and we'll name that variable offset y, because we want to offset it on the y-axis. This is equal to the negative of the data speed of the scroll top multiplied by our data speed. So if we would have a data speed of, for example, 0.33 and the scroll top value would be 1000 pixels, then our layer would have actually just moved 333 pixels instead of the full 1000 that we actually scrolled. Now we want to apply this value as some sort of CSS property, and we could use the background position, but what's better and recommended is using the transform and especially the translate 3D property. We will now store in a variable that we'll call translate. We will store the string that we'll later on use for the CSS property. So we'll say that it is equal to translate 3D, and then we'll open up the brackets and say the 0 and then comma. And now we will just also apply to the string our offset as the next value, and then we will finish off this string by saying pixels comma and then 0 and closing the bracket. Now if we assume that for y offset we have 1000 pixels, the compiled version of this string would look something like this. Now we want to apply this value to some sort of CSS property for our layer, and we can do this by referring to our layer and using the .css function. This function takes in two parameters, and the first one is which CSS property we want to use. In our case this is the transform property. The second parameter is what value we want to apply to this property. In our case we already defined the translate string up here, and this is the value that we want to use. Now this would work for most browsers, but we want to use some cross-browser compatibility, so I'll paste this down a few more times and we'll just say -webkit -transform -mos -transform -ms -transform and -o -transform. These are not needed, but they can often help you in some cases. Now if we go over into a browser and we refresh and scroll down, you'll see that the multi-parallax effect is now working. But as you can see down here, we have a problem with our content section. We already see in our content section the background of the images that are below the last layer. To fix this, we can apply a background color to the content section. We want to use the exact color that has the bottom pixel of this section so that we have a very smooth transition. Now let's go over into our editor and see how we can do this in the CSS. In the CSS we'll just create another .content, so we can style the content section, and in here we'll just give it a background color. The actual value for the illustration that I'm using here is #80b5a5, and if we would wait some time it would actually display the correct color here. But if we go over into our browser now and scroll down, you will see that we have a very nice section down here. If we would go even further and say that we have a minimum height of 1000 pixels in our CSS, in our browser we can then see that we can scroll down way further. This way you can simply add your content down here, or even add some content like text or a button at the top of your header. So yeah, that's it for this video, I guess. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Have an amazing week, and I'll see you all next time.